Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Drowning in Emails, Top Tips to Manage Them Like a Pro. I'm Teresa Resick, Director of Webinars here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And with me today are Mark Diamond and Dan Elam from Contoral, and we also have Charlie Andrews from Ovitas. ELO Digital Office is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to offer a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience, so feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows. And across the bottom of your screen is the list of all the widgets that are available to you. Group chat is available to you, and you do need to open this, and you do that by clicking on the icon that's along the bottom. And with group chat, you will be able to text chat with each other and also with a few of us here at AIIM. Do ask questions of the speakers throughout the hour using the Q&A feature, and that's to the left side of your screen. We will hold these questions until the end, where we should have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer them. But you can also use this feature to ask for technical assistance. You may download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list. That's to the right side of the slide area. There are also a few other documents and links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. Just click in there at any time, and the resource will open in a new browser tab, and you can save that and read that after the webinar. And at the end of the webinar, a brief survey will open in your browser, and it is open to you now below your slide area. And we'd greatly appreciate it if you take a few moments to offer your feedback and to suggest other topics for us to cover. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. And right now, I'd just like to introduce the panel of speakers that we have with us today. And first, by way of introductions, is Mark Diamond, and he is recognized as an industry thought leader in proactive records and information management, litigation readiness, and risk and compliance strategies. Under his leadership, Contoral has grown to be the largest independent provider of legal and regulatory litigation readiness and risk and compliance consulting services. As trusted advisors, he and his company help bridge legal, compliance, security, and business needs with effective process, technology, and change management. And also from Contoral, we have Dan Elam with us today, and he's one of their vice presidents. And Dan is a leading consultant for information governance programs, including records and email management, sensitive information, and country-specific regulations. He is a former U.S. technical expert in the International Standards Organization and is a frequent industry speaker and author. Dan is in the AIIM Company of Fellows. And then rounding out our panel today is Charlie Andrews. He is the Director of Sales and Business Development at Ovitas, Inc. To this role, he brings deep experience working with global organizations in the structured and unstructured content lifecycle management arena. He has participated in the evolution and implementation of content management from early newspaper magazine editorial systems through the development of structured content solutions for government and private industry to today's confluence of enterprise information management and global social media. Charlie works with organizations in the healthcare, manufacturing, standards and compliance, and global accounting finance markets. Ovitas is a premier business partner with ELO Digital Office in the USA and in Europe. So right now, I'm going to turn things over to Mark Diamond from Contoral to begin our talk today on email management. Mark?
Thank you, Teresa. This is Mark, and we're going to talk about a problem that we all sort of thought would go away many years ago, but still seems to be around, and that is that many organizations are just drowning in email. I mean, Dan, you get out there a lot. You talk to a lot of companies. What are you seeing with the current state of email, and is this a persistent problem of email accumulating?
Yeah, email is probably the single most difficult thing that we have to deal with when it comes to managing an entire organization's information. One of the problems is that for many years people didn't do records management correctly, and they assumed that you could have different retention for, say, an original document or a scanned image than you did from email. Well, in fact, you're supposed to apply the same retention and the same controls regardless of what the media type is. And not only that, but a lot of the technical platforms weren't really set up to help with that. Many of the technical platforms around email were strictly focused on amount of content, where you might limit the amount of information that someone could keep, regardless of whether or not all of that information was, under a legal hold or was considered a record. And so you end up with issues that affect your entire compliance program. And on top of that, the email is where we have most of our information. By some estimates, 70% of the actual records in an organization are stored in email. But it also represents usually a significant amount of the total storage that we have in an organization. So what we find is that people use email, as a chat, as a file transfer mechanism, as a way to make decisions and communicate. And the result is that email is the largest and usually one of the top 3 fastest growing areas of content for the entire enterprise. And that's only expected to continue for those organizations that don't have effective programs to get rid of the information in a legally defensible way, or have ways to effectively use, underlying content management platforms to be able to transfer links instead of the documents. So it's a big deal today.
Now, Dan, I've heard organizations say, well, hey, we don't have email on our server. We limit how much email's on our server. Problem solved. When in reality, users are just taking it from their server into their offline PST files. I mean, do we worry about that? I mean, is that an issue?
Sure. So you're right, and that's one of the things that we see. In fact, I have been amazed over the years at how sophisticated certain users can be to get around some of the email limitations. People that think it's difficult to comply with the rules, or they have a legitimate business reason to retain information that IT would otherwise get rid of, can turn into sophisticated programmers and write scripts and things that I would have never expected them to be able to do. But people will go through great lengths to store information that they think is important to their job. They usually mean well, but unfortunately it can cause compliance issues. The other issue that we have is that when you do start having users move a lot of this information to PST files, either on a local hard drive or maybe on a file share somewhere, all of that information becomes discoverable. And if you have a situation where you have legal, or let's say you're a government entity that has a Freedom of Information Act request, now you are legally required to go look in all those sources. And if you don't, then you can be subject to sanctions and, of course, other embarrassments. So this is something that ends up driving the cost up for e-discovery if they're not complying with the rules. And for organizations that have, relatively tight controls on the amount of storage, and most of the time you have a choice of time-based storage or the amount of storage that you can have. Most of the organizations that are not very mature are using the size of storage. So maybe you have a 2 gigabyte limit on the email. Those are the situations where you're most likely to have this underground archiving, where people will copy off the email into unapproved places to store the information.
It's interesting because we're seeing a lot of organizations adopt cloud-based storage like Office 365, and the advantage or disadvantage of some of those systems is they offer a tremendous amount, 50 gigabytes or even 100 gigabytes of email that any individual can store, but to some aspects, that just displaces the problem. You don't get away your e-discovery, your ongoing, part of your expenses lowered, but the other expenses tend to increase fairly significantly. So to some extent, we see that sort of kicking the can down the road. Yes, there's more storage, it is cheaper, but you still have this ongoing accumulation problem. One of the things that we see a lot of, I was talking to a company, a fairly large company, a couple weeks ago, and talking to the Chief Information Security Officer, and he came back and said, oh, well, we don't have any records in email. Our law firm told us we don't have any records in email. And our response is, well, I'm glad you feel that way. Unfortunately, the courts and the regulators probably feel very different. We do find email contains a significant amount of records, some of which reside in email exclusively. The problem is that email has grown up organically. It's typically grown up outside of traditional compliance controls, or oftentimes outside of records management systems. And People don't think about it, but what defines a record is not the medium. We all know this. It's the content, and the content of many emails contain records. Now, as a percentage of total overall emails, it can vary. On the low end is 5%, on the high end as much as 40% of emails could be records or might be records, but they definitely exist in records. Now, the separate question is, having emails, records in email, should they continue to live in the email server? Well, that's a different question. We'll talk about that a little bit later on the webinar, and the answer is typically no. You got to manage those and control those. But the we'll stick our head in the sand and pretend that there's no records in email, we think is a seriously bad idea and potentially non-compliant. And not only the issue around email records, Dan, you've seen this, even if it's a non-record, you've seen a lot of sensitive information in email. I mean, it's not just the records. What kind of stuff you see in email?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, unfortunately, email tends to be the common medium in which to communicate not only with internal stakeholders, but external ones as well. And so, in a worst case scenario, you might have a company going public in an IPO and someone discloses information that would relate to the IPO, in which case you're guilty of insider trading at that point, or you're a participant. But even things that are less severe than that can be things where you might have intellectual property or trade secrets about upcoming products or strategies or other things that you intend to do in the market that can end up being an impact. We also have personally identifiable information, employee information. And that gets to be even more complicated if you're a multinational, because there are all kinds of restrictions on what information can be moved across jurisdictional lines under, what periods of time. The fines are fairly severe. In some cases, it's $50,000 per record. So you're talking about significant amounts of information. And the problem is our email systems almost never have any good way to classify and control the information. So we don't have a good way to distinguish between what's sensitive and what's just regular information. And it doesn't matter whether it's a record. It can be sensitive and not be a record, as you pointed out, Mark. So, just relying on classic records management controls aren't enough. You have to have a classification system behind all of that to be able to control that. And so if you get this wrong, you can have pretty severe implications. We had a Fortune 500 company that made a mistake with their classification for security for email and ended up accidentally disclosing all of the financial information for the top managers in the company. So everybody in the company got to see, how much so-and-so was paid and what their other bonus program was, and everything else related to that personal information. As you might guess, that caused some hard feelings and some other concerns in that particular organization, and that was really something that didn't even have significant legal implications.
It's interesting. On one hand, email is clearly ubiquitous. There's so much of it. There's all around. It's everywhere. It's on our laptops, on our tablets, on our cell phones, even our watches. But on the other hand, it's real. It's got these compliance considerations. It's got records considerations. It's got sensitive data issues, and we see a lot of knee-jerk reactions, what we call bad strategies of organizations, saying, "Hey, we don't have time to deal with this, so we're just going to fix the problem." And unfortunately, some of these strategies sometimes backfire. Dan, you've come in after the fact. You've seen a lot of these backfired strategies. Walk us through a few.
Yeah, so the common one that we see is an aggressive deletion schedule, and it's either by by the amount of time, a 30, 60-day, 90-day policy. Where we're going to get rid of things, or by storage. Maybe it's a few hundred meg, or 2 gig is sort of a common number that we use in like Exchange World. But the problem is that in addition to not being compliant, we end up with the issues like we talked about for the underground archiving, where people know that they're going to need access to this information. Sometimes it's just a CYA situation where they want to be able to document a decision that was made, and so they'll keep a copy and they'll find all kinds of ways to do it. A lot of times that's copying, again, off to the PST file. Sometimes it's copying off into, a traditional enterprise content management system, but without any classification. Sometimes it's just storing as an individual file in a folder somewhere. In a lot of places, they'll also print them and just set those off to the side. So the whole idea for some organizations, and this usually comes from the IT side, where they say that there are no records in email. So all of our transactions, all of our true records are stored somewhere else. And the reality is that we've yet to find an organization where that's true. Even a couple companies that have worked really hard to do almost nothing in email still end up with decisions that are documented and made through email. Some other organizations take a look at the backup side where you say, well, as long as it's a backup tape, I can get it back out. You might be able to do that, but a lot of times you're going to lose certain information because it's hard to put together the threads without reconstructing the entire email repository. But the big thing is that your costs are very, very high. When it comes to e-discovery, we're looking at over $2,000 per gigabyte to be able to process this information off the backup tapes, and it can be even higher. We have one customer that went through with the regulators after being fined hundreds of millions of dollars. They thought they had done a good job searching through the backup tapes, only to find out that they didn't actually understand the formats. And after they had reached a settlement with the regulator, they were forced to go back and say, oh, no, we made a mistake. We didn't give you all of the information at the time, and so here's the additional information. That mea culpa ended up costing, over $100 million again in additional fines. So, just if you don't have a good way to get the information out, people are going to come up with all kinds of ways to be able to put the information there. Whereas, the best practice is being able to do the classification and work in conjunction with your content management platform, whether it be a OpenText or Highland or Elo or, some other product like that, where you do have the good controls on the back end. You have a natural place where you're going to store them. The problem is, how do you make that so that it's easy enough that the users can do it without being onerous? Because if it's onerous, they're just going to come back to these same bad email classification strategies.
So what we're going to make a point of today is to say that email is an information governance challenge. I mean, email isn't just an IT problem. There's a fairly significant role of technology in this, but it's a question of marrying your technology with your retention processes, taking what we call a big bucket approach with the 5-second rule, which means it shouldn't take a user. Your process should allow the user to be able to store and classify email in the right place in 5 seconds or hopefully less. Use the technology to apply full governance framework, not only for retention, for data security classification, for access and collaboration. I mean, this is another important part of content and documents. Too many organizations have 10,000 employees and 10,000 silos. Well, some of this is good information that we should share and collaborate that make us more productive. We're also a believer that don't necessarily prevent users from saving non-record email. You may want to create a working documents area for email to say, hey, you can save this amount of email for maybe a year or two. Maybe these are drafts. Maybe these are convenience copies. Maybe this is just personal productivity. The idea is we don't want to shut down them saying, no, you can't save that, because then they're going to do underground archiving. So what we do want to allow it, but allow it in a controlled and managed way. And then again, we've talked about this as avoid the aggressive deletion strategies. I know it feels good, and we're the first one, and Dan said it, 70% of email is either expired or unneeded or low business value. We don't doubt for a minute that a large chunk of your email can and should be deleted. But if you take a knee-jerk, we're just going to get rid of it type of reaction, that you actually may be creating more problems, more risks, more costs than you're actually solving. So we need a slightly more sophisticated approach. And Dan, we've seen you mentioned some of the smart strategies here. You mentioned moving from a time-based strategies. What are some of the other smart strategies you're seeing?
Well, the most effective one by far is to take the email and be able to store it in the content management system. So the content management systems have much better records management capabilities. And, keep in mind that a lot of the records in our retention schedule are subject to event-based retention, meaning it's a life of asset or after the transaction plus so many years, where it's not just from the creation date of the document. And, there are systems that can do some limited email against, you mentioned like Office 365 and some other things in the cloud, but they tend to be fairly low end and can't do those more complex records management requirements. You do want to increase the quotas, just, whatever they need to use, keep, but find a way to be able to get that information into the content management repository, or at least have a sync process to be able to do that. And then ideally, you're applying one set of deletion against the actual record. So maybe your quota is over a certain amount, but you're confident through your processes that all of the records have been migrated into the ECM repository, so that then we can do that central management and make sure we have that single pane of glass to be able to manage all of our content. Obviously, you need to cut down on that underground archiving, so disabling the PST files, limiting the ability both from a technical perspective and a policy perspective about storing email outside of the repository is a big deal. And then you have to educate the people. Most organizations are pretty good at understanding that this is corporate information and we need to use this in a broader sense. And that doesn't mean that people don't still think of email as their very personal information. And if you explain to them why it's important from a regulatory perspective or a cost perspective, then we see much higher compliance rates. But you also have to let the folks know this is coming so they can anticipate. You have to make it easy for them to be able to do the records declaration of the emails. But that's something that you can plan for. It's not going to happen overnight, but make sure that you really focus on the change management even more so than any of the technology options.
That change management is usually the most critical, but also the most omitted step. We see organizations with policy and technology, and then they just sort of blast it out, and getting users, to change their habits, to say, hey, this will be a win for you, we find is very important. So just summarizing, what is good? We talked about what not to do. Let's focus on what to do. Give users an option of being able to save in working documents, being able to save records in the right place. Again, these repositories that I'm hearing here are typically technology solutions. Elo is going to talk about some good options here to be able to do that. Make it quick in less than 5 seconds. When they do store emails, make sure you're applying a full governance framework on there. Sell the win, make it productive, saying, hey, my email's no just longer locked up. Now the right emails, certain emails, we're going to be able to share and collaborate. We're going to take the drama. We're going to store something for a period of time, and then we're going to let the system delete it. We're not going to try and do these big sweeps where everybody freaks out, but just slowly over time, the old email goes away through a defensible disposition process. And then finally, if we do need to legal hold, we're not going to freak out. We're not going to make mistakes because we can centrally control and manage email. And that's not only going to reduce risk in litigation, but the fact that we have centrally managed email is going to significantly reduce cost. And oftentimes the cost savings can be more than the entire email, CapEx and OpEx, almost the entire project. I mean, we've seen some huge cost savings in this area. So be smart about it. And it feels like a really tough thing to solve, but we've seen a lot of organizations be very successful in terms of managing email. So Dan and I have touched on a number of topics here. We're just going to point you to some additional resources here. We have a white paper on creating modern, compliant, and easier exit retention schedules. We have an upcoming webinar tomorrow, as a matter of fact, on freshman orientation for records management. What are the basics of records management? We have a good white paper on email classification. How do you classify email? How to delete it, and then finally a good white paper on preventing employees from hoarding documents. So all of these are available, or excuse me, a webinar on that. All of these are available on a complimentary basis on the Contoro website. And so we talked a little bit about, hey, let's take a big picture view. We talked about the legal and regulatory components of it. Contoro, we're the largest independent provider of information governance consulting services. But now let's talk a little bit about some of the technology and how do we support that. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie. Charlie, you want to talk about we sort of set the table, if you will, saying, hey, there's a big role for the technology. What's the technology and how's it working this?
Hi, Mark, and thank you, and thank you, Dan. And just a quick thank you to our audience. I know we have a diverse audience today, and thank you for taking the time to join us. I think as we have seen, there is, for good or bad, the fact of life that email is here and it's part of our organizational or business process. I will confess to being one of those people in the department who is known as potentially the pack rat for emails. And I have executives and other people coming to me quite often saying, you know, I need emails about this particular contract. I need emails about this particular customer, client, whatever the contract that we have with a supplier, whatever that happens to be. And with PST files, with all the other available ways of storing this information, often I spend quite a bit of time finding information for other people. Well, email is an organizational asset. I don't think there's any denying it, and I think Mark and Dan pointed this out along through their talk. You know, most organizations consider content to be assets. That's a modern way of looking at it. There's a huge industry devoted to helping that. If you're in companies or organizations that have engineering or tech doc, you know, sales, marketing, the whole supply chain, whatever they happen to be, many companies spend quite a bit of money investing in technology, investing in methods to be able to manage and use that information as corporate assets. Interestingly, email seems to be taking a back seat in the sense of putting all of that information into a place where it can be shared and collaborated and be part of the overall data set that are the corporate assets. Right. So as we go into this, I have a couple of poll questions that I'd like to ask. The first of them is, for our diverse audience today, different types of organizations, how many of you have something in your organization that does establish some sort of formal email management solution? And we have a couple of yes, we do, and sadly, we don't answers. And I'd like to take a minute for those of you who are willing to go ahead and you know, click on those, and we can see sort of where we are today with our audience. And as you're going ahead to do that, we can talk a little bit more about where we can do, what we can do in terms of technology, what we can do in terms of solutions around email. So now I'm not seeing much in the way of response just yet, but it may just be a refreshing thing. So let me continue on while you are voting. Oh, there we go. I just refreshed. Pardon me. Okay, so preliminary, I see about 30%, a little roughly over 31% of the audience out there of you have something in place, which is actually a fairly significant amount. I'm seeing almost 70% responding that they do not have something in place today. All right, so that'll give you a little bit of an idea of where you all are. So take a look at email and email management and the storage and management of that as a top priority in an organization. And the message from us is treat email like any other content asset, right? You can integrate emails into your business process. Mark and Dan talked quite a bit about what comes in emails. We all know what's in emails. There are personal emails, there are business emails, there's sensitive information, there's HR information from HIPAA and any other way, there's contractual information, etc. So that is an asset that needs to be caught and captured, all right? And in capturing it, one of the methods that you can use in using a solution or a system to do that is to take a look at the individual pieces of information that you're capturing and add value to them. And that is, I think was mentioned earlier, how do you take this information and classify it so that you absolutely can find it, that you can absolutely account for it, et cetera? Well, classification in our mind is another word for adding metadata. Could be keywords, it could be any number of things like that. But adding metadata to emails to enhance their value and be able to categorize them. the benefit of also doing that is that you end up having something that is now searchable either by full text or searchable by keywording and metadata, and it can be done on an enterprise level. Now, you want to make sure that by doing this, you also have a solution that allows for a very sophisticated permissions-based access to these things, that HR emails are not being able to be viewed by engineering, et cetera, whatever it happens to be in your organization, all right? And the archiving of emails over the long term will help aid both the information technology side, and it'll aid any organization in looking at any kind of regulations compliance. Like any other asset, people have been saying this for a long time, the right info at the right time. Well, email should also fit in to the same category as any other kind of information that you would want to deliver or be able to have access to, right? Ultimately, making server environments in an IT infrastructure more flexible and more performant is an added benefit to any kind of solution that you might be putting in place. Okay. So here are some considerations for organizations to look at. There are different ways to archive emails. We would suggest that there's a combination of both the client side, say an Outlook client, for instance, and an email server, in this case maybe an Exchange server, that could be used, and there are a couple of benefits that could come along with that. One is that you have the ability to have change management be in place. If you add tools to a very familiar desktop tool that allows somebody, as Mark and Dan had said, to take care of something within a 5-second rule of seeing an email and be able to file it right from their own clients. And also the ability to take genres of email or categories and automatically apply information to them, automatically file them at the server side is also something that can be very, very strong, and it can be made friendly because those things can be set up so that the people looking at emails and having to deal with emails and wanting to keep emails are still interacting with them the way they think that they're going to, but at the same time, you're capturing these emails on the server and then transferring them to a central content management system. Okay, you might want to consider how you're going to deal with private emails in an organization. Emails, everybody has emails. They're all coming, as somebody said, on phones, on iPads, on everything else. But from the organizational standpoint, do you have any rules and regulations around what is private email, what is business email? Is there a way to categorize and put those over there? A solution that allows somebody to have their own private area within, say, a content management system would allow them to potentially put their own private emails in an area like that. Yet, when it comes down to some long-term discovery or governance, you can still set up some rules and regulations on how that might be discoverable. Collaboration is a very important topic, and that comes back to me potentially being the pack rat. I don't want to be the pack rat for my organization. I want people to be able to instantly get to any kind of content around a particular topic, and that does include email. Right? Flexible retention periods were discussed earlier, and any kind of content management solution that you might want to consider should have the ability to give you the flexible retention rules, whether or not it's on the date of inception of an email or whether or not there's something else in the email that causes it to be needed to retain longer than the first time it was received. And those rules should also be able to comply with whatever your local government or governance regulations happen to be on a global basis. Right? Deletion. In a content management environment, you can set up rules for deletion. And deletion can be in multiple stages where it just removes things from the sight of people, removes things temporarily into a holding area, and then based on rules and regulations that you can set up for the different genre, the different classifications of emails, those can be formally deleted over time. This is a lot more difficult to do in an email server environment, much more capable of being done in a content management system that's geared for retention rules and is geared for being able to take all of those different types of content, not just emails, and manage them in that process. Okay. Another thing that is very important is the attachments that come along with emails, and we talked briefly about this in the larger picture, but attachments, as we all know, are everything. In our company, we have contracts that come in signed as attachments. There are human resources information that come in. There are resumes and things like that. Emails are used to send resumes around to different directors in a company, or to managers, so that they can look at potential hires for new employees. All of this type of information, managing those attachments and relating them to the original email is very, very easy to do in terms of setting up a repository in a content management environment to be able to manage those and establish relationships between those. Also, attachments in many content management environments, and the ones that we're looking at, allow you to store something once in a particular classified area and then be able to share that by sharing links to it, as opposed to making copies of these attachments and having multiple of them running around your organization. Okay, so taking a look at setting up some semi or automated storage capabilities, they can be done on a transaction-related basis, so that you can set up rules, seeing transactions, seeing particular events happen, and have a content management system manage these types of assets along those ways. One of the things that we sort of didn't touch on was the ability to back up in an intelligent manner all of the different types of content, including emails, that you might have, and that begs the argument for something like a content management system. Okay, so this is the rising tide floats all boats slide, and it just basically reiterates what we've been saying all along. They're both driving each other. With the rise of emails, the rise of the pressure on organizations to deal with them, they're symbiotic, and it's just ever more of an issue that organizations need to put something in place to address how they're going to look at emails, attachments, and the like. Now, I have a second poll question. This is the last one for the session today. Attachments are incredibly important. Where you do it, what you do with them, how you access them, how you share them, needs to be, we think, defined fairly well within an organization. Now, how are you dealing with email attachments right now? Are you not dealing with them, or just leaving them with the emails and that's it? Are you manually filing attachments, which a lot of us are guilty of? And do you have a solution in place to automate the capture of attachments? So I'll give a few people a few minutes or a minute just to think about that. Okay, and I think it's going to be just a second. And our voting, if everybody's out there voting, then we'll get some results very quickly. Okay, and let's see, I'm not sure if I can get see how we do with the results. Aha, the results just came back. Okay, 42, almost 43% of you today are not dealing with attachments, just simply leaving them with the emails. So you find the email, you find the attachment. Just curious how many of you are guilty of taking the attachment, dragging and dropping it to your desktop, and then having that attachment also be in multiple places on an email server, on your desktop. Now you've got at least 2 places to discover that information, and you can imagine how many other ways in sending it around to different people that might be. Many are manual filing. About 55% today, the majority of today, are manually filing attachments in one manner or another. And then only about 2.5% actually have a solution in place to automate the capture of attachments. So I think that that's a very telling comparison of statistics, and one that should be considered as you look at your organization. Okay, so what kind of solutions are potentially out there? And this, I'm keeping this purposely at a high level, but the 2 basic genres that I want to talk about, or areas I want to talk about, are basic integration of solutions, and then platform or IT-oriented solution integrations. At the very basic, something like an Outlook client or an IBM Lotus Notes client or whatever you happen to be using in a formal email client should have the capability of allowing you to drag and drop an attachment or an email into some sort of organizing principle. We would posit that organizing principle should be a content management system as opposed to an email server environment, but it should allow you to that interactive. I've read the email, I'm going to drag and drop it into this place, and it will automatically go where it's supposed to go. All right. People also, as I think somebody earlier said, that people get around this by writing their own little scripts and routines and things like that. Well, it should also have the capability of being able to do those types of things, but you want to be able to put that under some sort of regulation. Right? And then the ability to just choose a direct folder by saying, this is where I want to store this. All right? Additionally, those types of clients should be intuitive and easy to use. In the end, that helps change management. If it's a familiar tool, if I'm using a tool for email filing that is exactly inside my Microsoft Outlook client, then it's just another menu pick, and I can work very quickly with that. In terms of server side, things like Microsoft Exchange Web Services is often used for server-side email management, where you set up applications within the email server using EWS as a way to manage the aggregation of different types of emails and the transfer of those emails to a central content management system. At the same time, when ingesting those into a content management system, you can set up automated rules where it applies additional keywords or information to enhance the value of that and make it more discoverable. Right? There are for those of you that are out there using IBM, there's certainly solutions, and for other types of email solutions, client server solutions, there are different methods and different ways to set up integration into different content management environments as well. Okay, I'd like to finish up very quickly with just a couple of case studies on companies that went ahead and went through the effort of putting in organizational principles and content management solutions to offload their email and keep it in an archive repository. The first one is a global medical technology firm. They're making different types of devices, etc., for the treatment of chronic disease. This company has about 45,000 people worldwide, and company-wide, their challenge was how do they organize not only their emails, but also, in this case, they were focused on digital personnel files. And those things go hand in hand, as we all know. Their decision was to take a look at this, to make the decision to move this off of their email structure, whatever they had in place, and put in place an enterprise content management system called ELO Professional. That brought to them the ability to do indexing and archiving of email, as well as add these keywords or metadata which added value to each of the emails and attachments that were coming in. And then what was very important to them is that they wanted to put them into they wanted that information in right protected selection fields. So when they applied additional value or metadata to those emails for search purposes, they wanted that protected so that other people couldn't get in there and change it. And that talked to about some of their compliance regulations. Immediately, they saw that the time that people were taking and the space that was being taken up by emails was being saved dramatically by putting in a central asset repository like a content management system. Right? And again, across an organization with appropriate permissions, they were able to find emails quickly. They were able to relate emails to other content sets so that they had the full conversation around whether it's product information or whatever it happened to be. Right? They liked the fact that in this particular solution, they could look at the world like they would look at Windows Explorer, but it was in a sophisticated content management environment that they had all the other controls for. And of course, they made their whole email environment a bit more performant because they were offloading a lot of the load from their email servers. Right? My second case study is a multinational pharma or biochemistry company. And this company manufactures things like nylon filaments. They manufacture all sorts of products, elements into cloth and artificial cloth and things like that. they had a very specific issue. And it's a global company. This company was a European division. They had about 15,000 emails containing documents a month in this one division that were of concern to them. And they were under regulatory requirements. They found that their storage area network, where they were just keeping attachments and keeping emails, was not meeting the security requirements of their local government. So they needed to combine that with also having to have access to all the documents, including the emails, so they could relate them together. They needed to put it in a place where it was revision-proof, that people could not get in. That was to reduce their corporate risk for both incoming and outgoing content. So they kept both types of content in the repository in a way that it was not able to be changed because that was a regulation. They chose a solution called ELO Enterprise, which is very much like ELO Professional, except that you can then diversify it in an IT infrastructure across multiple server environments. And immediately what they found was their costs were reduced and that people were using their time more sensibly. They were able to find things more quickly, both in saving things and in retrieving things. And in addition, they satisfied the local version of the FDA compliance for all of their email content and the legal and fiscal requirements that were corresponding to organizing and archiving these relevant documents and all the email traffic. Okay. For those of you who are curious, we invite you to go ahead and take a look at ELO Digital Office's website in the United States. There is much more information. There's some information that you can download directly from today's webinar, and there's more information on both of the solutions that I mentioned today. And I wanted to just say thank you very much for taking the time, and it was a pleasure to be part of the webinar today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now let me turn it back over to Teresa.
Yeah, we've been listening to Charlie Andrews from Ovitas, and before that we were listening to Mark Diamond and Dan Elam from Contoral. And not only the resources that Charlie just mentioned there, but also the resources that Mark and Dan mentioned that Contoral offer, they're all listed in that resources link right now. So feel free to click on those. I'll open in that other browser for you. Check that out after the webinar, or download a copy of the slides, and you'll see these links there to those sites. So a lot of different ways, and I highly encourage you to avail yourself to all of this really good information that our team's been sharing with you. So thank you. We do have a lot of questions that have been coming in. I'm going to do my best to get to as many of these as we can during the next 5 or 10 minutes that we have here. And oh goodness, more questions keep popping in here. Let me start with this first question here, and I'm going to first start this over with Dan and Mark for you to address this from a governance compliance type of standpoint. For the types of organizations that do use webmail, the Gmail for business kind of things, in addition to the Outlook 365, how does a person manage those types of emails? Is it any different?
Well, the answer is just if you go to Office 365 or Gmail or Google Docs or something else like that, you still have to manage email. The advantage of those systems is you can have lots of storage very cheaply. And there's a tendency to say, wow, now that we're using Office 365 or now we're looking at using Gmail, our problems have gone away because now it's all in the cloud, when in reality, obviously the same compliance considerations apply, the same records considerations, and as Dan alluded to, for an international organization, transborder issues, all the compliance issues to be able to do that. And I'm going to hand the second part of this to Dan, is that those tools often have a lot of governance controls. They have retention, they have classification, but you have to set it up the right way, which usually means setting it up before you go into the cloud, not dumping everything in the cloud and say we're going to figure it out later. That's just kicking the can down the road. Dan, do you want to answer the second part of that? So, for organizations that have these cloud-based services, problem solved?
Well, so no. Some of the systems have some improvements, and things like Office 365 just yesterday got some announcements at the Microsoft Ignite conference that talk about a couple of the new integration points. So there's certainly some improvements. At a worst case scenario, what you have to do is you have to copy the information and store it as say, a text file in your ECM platform. That's the worst case scenario. And that would work for any webmail. For the other ones, you have a variety of centralized tools that you can use to try and integrate. You can do some exports. There are also organizations that have set up particular workstations to do the flagged copies and copy those into the ECM system. So you've got a variety of options. That is not a insurmountable challenge at all. It may be a little more difficult than using a fat client or using something more mainstream like Office 365. But even the things like Hotmail and Gmail, I mean, you can certainly make all those work, and it's really not that difficult.
Charlie, I want to direct a question over to you since you're a partner with ELO and hoping you know the answer
Sure.
with this. Does ELO have any federal government customers? I mean, you mentioned the kinds of industries that you typically work with. Federal government,
Right.
Other highly regulated industries, are they part of your customer base?
That's an interesting question, and a two-part question. One, ELO in the U.S. established our presence, or ELO, the company established the presence in the beginning of 2016 and has been growing ever since. They are global, and in terms of government customers around the world, the answer is yes. In terms of U.S. federal government customers, no. That's something that we are absolutely looking at, both from the Ovitas standpoint as a business partner and from the ELO standpoint. Ovitas itself does have government customers. We have had customers like the Marines, and we have customers that are under the Department of Energy, contracts under the Department of Energy. So Ovitas is very familiar with working with the federal government. ELO, in its presence, now 2 years in the U.S., is building towards that.
Good, thank you. Next question I want to direct over to the Contoral folks. Someone is asking that, if they're happy to change their retention schedule to accommodate unique situations of email, and I'm even questioning at this point, is it really that unique? We've been having email for decades. Why not go with a simple approach like Capstone? And I realize that's email management.
I'll answer the first part of that, and then I'll let Dan answer the second part of it. So first of all, a retention schedule is media agnostic. There should not be an exception in your records retention schedule for email. Email is just another type of medium, and what your records retention schedule should do is follow content. Now, what's happening is the vast majority of organizations are going towards a simpler, more executable, bigger bucket retention schedule. That's not only for email, that's quite frankly for all information. The day of the super detailed 120-page records retention schedule, those just don't work. But there's another very subtle point here, which is you can still have a records retention schedule. When you implement an email in an enterprise content management system and some type of archive, you're going to have a file plan or a taxonomy that may be a subset of your records retention schedule. So don't expect to implement your records retention schedule line by line and translate that into a direct taxonomy. Most organizations take a much more simpler approach with their records retention schedule to be able to do that. So you can still have a records retention schedule. You obviously want to make sure your file plan is compliant and compatible with your records retention schedule, but oftentimes we see more simple. Now, the other question is, which is a good one, is the U.S. government adopted a role-based approach called Capstone, which we don't think is a very smart approach. And Dan, well, I'll let you answer that. Dan, what do you think? You're an expert in this Capstone. What do you think?
Yeah, Capstone is one of those things that has the potential to completely change the traditional view of records management. Basically, what Nara said is that managing email is hard, so we're just going to give up. And except for a couple of these particular roles, we're going to capture everything. We basically are just going to set a time limit. And even if that's a critical record related to, say, the operation of a nuclear submarine, so we can get rid of it, and it doesn't matter. That is completely at odds with how information governance and records management have grown over the years. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that works. Capstone is not an option for commercial firms right now. And, it's not a surprise that, sometimes government gets to operate under rules that, commercial organizations and, municipal and state governments don't get to operate under. So I think that's going to be a real issue. If you are a federal agency and you can take advantage of Capstone, frankly, I would do it. It results in significant cost savings. It's defensible because of the rules. Is it a best practice from an information governance or records management perspective? No. But if I was particularly a commercial firm, there is no way that I would test that until someone else gets brave and goes before the courts, because I suspect that they're going to lose when they get to court.
So it's interesting the federal government went from a super detailed approach, which surprisingly didn't work, to we're going to do everything based on roles, which is not a simpler, we think it's a wrong-headed approach. And the problem is that there is some information that people do want to save for a very long time. Maybe it's a minority of information. Maybe it's a small part of it, but there is some documents information that does need to be kept. And applying a role-based, I want to say even simplistic, we'll call it a wrong-headed approach. Be careful. That's we like simpler. We don't like the way, as Dan said, if a commercial, be careful. I don't think, nor do I think that will be the way of the future. We'll see, but I definitely don't. I have some real doubts over that.
Okay. I want to squeeze in one more question here, and Charlie, I want to ask this of you. Someone's asking about, what information should go into archives and how to select and filter this information. Your thoughts on this? Charlie, you need to unmute.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, I was, and I apologize. That's a great question, and it, I think what it really boils down to, because I know we don't have much time left, is this. The pendulum can swing both ways. The pendulum can swing to, we're not going to keep anything, to the pendulum can swing to all the other side, which is we're going to archive everything and put it all into one place. And obviously either one of those probably is not the solution that you want. The thing that I think you need to do is to do an internal audit of the types of information that you have. And most companies like Ovitas and ELO can work with you on those types of audits, and you look at that and you say, fine, we need to establish genres. Now, what will help that is once you've started to establish those genres, then you need to be able to have a solution in place that has enough capability and rules management to be able to interact with those emails. So in a very simple way, anything that comes into your corporate email environment that has an attachment or that has a signature or some type of thing that points to a specific piece of information, maybe you can key off those rules. Keywords that you might find in an email when it's doing full text search, maybe you can key off those things. There's not one answer for every organization on what you want to select and what you want to filter. I think that looking at like any other piece of content, having an audit about that content, about your emails, about types of attachments that are coming in, will take you a long way towards being able to set up some basic types of filtering, basic types of storage management.
Thank you. And a little birdie has chirped in my ear concerning another question in here. ELO Digital Office does have a presence in Canada, and they do currently have clients in Canada. So yes, this is not just applicable for the U.S., but certainly all of North America. So just wanted to answer that other question as well.
Sure.
And we are getting to the end of our webinar hour, and very much want to thank the speakers who have been with us today. We offer just some little slides that's up here right now about AIM training. We do offer instructor-led training. Of course, AIM's another resource in addition to the fine folks who've been with us today. So with our training, it's online, self-paced classes, a variety of different formats. And so you can thoroughly immerse yourself with these offerings, and we can even arrange for a trainer to come to your place of business and provide a custom perspective of our programs for your organization. So all that kind of information can be found at aim.org/training, and you can reach out by email, and there's a few people here at AIM that can answer your questions and help you find the right program for you. And just want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available in the next day or two at our resources webinars page. Again, mentioning all of the resources that we do have available to you today, the links that are in that little box to the right of the slide area. Also, appreciate if you would take a few moments to take the survey when the webinar is over with. Very much want to thank our underwriter, ELO Digital Office. Without the support from our solution providers, AIM wouldn't be able to bring you these free educational programs. So thank you, ELO, for your contribution and your sponsorship. As we bring our webinar to a close today, I just want to leave you with the closing thoughts of our speakers. And so I'm just going to go right down the line here and just ask for your closing thoughts or key takeaway. So let me start first with Mark Diamond from Contoral, your closing thought today.
Well, the closing thought is that email, because it sort of grew up organically, is something that's easy to ignore, and especially with organizations moving their email into the cloud, it's easy to continue to ignore, but do that at your own peril. We think there's a tremendous business case. There's a lot of cost savings, but you have to take a smart approach to it. You have to take an information governance approach, and even though this overloading of email seems like an unachievable problem, we've seen many organizations have been very successful. Not only becoming more compliant and reducing risk, but also, quite frankly, saving a lot of money in the process versus the other, we're going to pilot on approach.
Thank you, Mark. Dan Elam, also from Contoral, your closing thoughts today.
Yeah, I guess just sort of keeping it simple. Email is a real issue. We have records, and it tends to be the most important information content that we can manage. And the good news is there are products like, ELO and many others on the market that can do a good job. Once you have a framework and a program in place, the good news is that the technology can really help you be effective, and you can do so in ways that will improve your compliance, reduce your risk, reduce your costs, and make it so that the users will actually use it. So.
Thank you, Dan. And Charlie Andrews from Ovitas, your closing thoughts today.
And thank you. And Dan, thank you, because my initial reaction was also keep it simple, maybe from a slightly different perspective. In terms of solutions, you can start out, don't boil the ocean. Start out in a small sense, take a look, do an audit for a portion of your organization, take a look and see what benefits that you're going to get by potentially attacking this type of organization principle around incoming emails and attachments, all of those different types of piece of content. Look at the value of that information as it relates to the other content in your organization, giving you more of a holistic picture of the assets that you have and how you can collaborate on those assets and how you can put them to a broader organizational use.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. For AIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we will see you on our next webinar. And have a great afternoon.